I want to welcome everyone to our third seminar of the academic year. We try to do this weekly. We average 2 to 3 per month. And I also want to welcome our colleagues from Georgia Tech. For those of you who don't know, we are broadcasting this seminar to Georgia Tech through the internet, interactive video conferencing. We're also making a videotape of the seminar because we have 4 other universities that have requested a videotape of this seminar, and they include NC State, Texas A&M, University of Florida, and even Georgia Tech wants a videotape of this seminar. So let me introduce our speaker. Our speaker is Dr. Alvin Weinberg, who really needs no introduction, but for the younger people in the audience, I should tell you that he was one of the pioneers of the nuclear business back during the Manhattan Project. So all of the information you hear today about people in the Manhattan Project, it's first-hand information. He was research director of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory from 1948 to 1955, and then he became director of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory from 1955 to 1974. After that, he founded and was the director of the Oak Ridge Institute for Energy Analysis. He's really been a good friend of this department. We get him each year to come and reminisce about the old days, and we're going to continue doing this as long as he would put up with us. And so it is indeed a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Weinberg.
Thank you very much, Lee. Many years ago, when I started on the Manhattan Project, I was the youngest person around. And look at me now, I'm one of the few survivors. I'm 85 years old now. And Lee said, well, rather than give a real talk, why don't you just reminisce about the olden days? And so I decided that I will reminisce about the olden days, but will also try to talk about things that are important for the future of nuclear energy.
Put this
on. Have to have that.
Yeah, I might want to repeat what you just said.
Well, to make a long story short, I'm 85 years old. I haven't been active in nuclear energy for quite a while. So what I have to say about nuclear energy itself will appear to many of you to be rather dated, just the talk of an old man. But I think it is important for the current generation to get a historical sense of how did we get to where we are now. And so what I shall do is I will first talk about some of the quote-unquote great men who I was very fortunate to have interacted with in the old days, beginning about 1941. And then I will talk about my views, such as they are, of, well, basically the question, will nuclear energy survive? Because, as you know, there are a number of places in the world where nuclear energy had a pretty good start, but it doesn't seem to be surviving. Sweden, for example. Norway is a good example because at the very beginning of the nuclear era, the Norwegians under Dr. Randers built a heavy water reactor. And Norway was supposed to get into the business, but they don't build reactors in Norway anymore. They have North Sea oil, which is pretty good. Well, I'll start with the person that, to my mind, really was, in a way, the inventor of nuclear energy. Well, not this person, but it's, oh dear. Yeah. But it's this person. Now let's see if we have a, well, you can use this as a pointer. This person. That is Leo Szilard, Szilard. And Leo Szilard was Hungarian, and in fact you can make a pretty good case that nuclear energy in a way was a Hungarian invention, because in addition to Szilard you had other people of at least comparable stature. In 1933, Szilard was living in London at the time, and he had read in the newspapers that Ernest Rutherford, who is in a way the founder of experimental nuclear physics, had said that anybody who talks about large-scale release of energy from nuclear processes was talking nonsense. Moonshine, I think, was the word that was used. And Szilard, in his memoirs, says that statements of that sort by people in high positions always irritate me. And so he decided that he would try to figure out a way of getting nuclear energy. And he says, again in his memoirs, that as he was walking on the streets of London and he was stopped by a traffic light, it suddenly occurred to him that if there were a nuclear reaction which emitted, say, 2 neutrons as a result of absorbing 1 neutron, then one has the possibility of establishing a nuclear chain reaction. And he goes on to say that this became rather an obsession with him, and he actually proposed that one systematically examine every element in the periodic chart to see whether it had a potential of being the basis for a nuclear chain reaction. He finally decided that, well, there was an element that might be possible, and that was beryllium. And at the time it was known that beryllium indeed had the possibility of, in fact, supported the reaction of beryllium absorbs a neutron, gives off 2 neutrons, and then decays into 2 helium atoms. And he patented his idea. Szilard was a great one for patenting ideas. And if you look at those old patents of Szilard, in many respects they are forerunners of present-day elementary reactor theory. That was in 1935 that the patent was awarded. It was a British Admiralty patent. Well, what can I say about Leo Szilard? He was the best example I have ever known of a person who basically was his own man. He didn't really care much about what other people thought, because, as he said in his book, The Voice of the Dolphins, a book that he wrote many years later, he said that he doesn't see why the views, or the average views, of a bunch of rather ordinary people should have precedence over the views of a really smart person, meaning Leo Szilard. And that was typical of him. Well, to give you a flavor of what kind of guy he was, I remember in 1960, 68, I think it was, somewhere around there. He had got very interested in the question of how do you live with a bomb, not have nuclear war. And he became very interested in what later became the Pugwash movement. How many of you have heard of Pugwash? Yes. Pugwash is the name of a small town in Nova Scotia, and it is where scientists from all over the world meet and set governments to rights. They discuss simple matter like how do we live with a bomb, and then they make reports to the government, and the government either accepts them or rejects them. This was the only place really in the world where Russian and Chinese scientists were discussing with Western scientists what was wrong with the military posture of the superpowers. Well, I happened to be in Washington at that time, and Leo Szilard got in touch with me. He at the time was living in the DuPont Plaza Hotel. So those of you who know Washington remember the DuPont Plaza Hotel is right at DuPont Plaza at the end of, or beginning of Massachusetts Avenue. And he said to me, Alvin, I need your advice. I said, well, what do you need it on? And he said, you come over to my room at the DuPont Plaza Hotel. Turned out that Leo Szilard had had bladder cancer, and he cured himself by hiring as his physician an oncologist who was sort of a tame oncologist, and agreed that Szilard would work out the protocol for how to deal with the bladder cancer, what energy x-rays and where and so on. And that was the deal. And sure enough, when Szilard died, it wasn't bladder cancer that he died of. He died of a heart attack a few years later, so he cured himself. Well, I went out to see him. He was convalescing. He was in the process of doing his radiation treatments. And he said, Alvin, we got to do something about the world. I said, yes. Pugwash has outlived its usefulness. Oh. What we have to do is choose the very best scientists in America, and the Russians will choose the very best scientists in Russia, and they will meet for a week or so in Moscow and will set the world to rights. And what I want your advice on is who the American delegation ought to be. And it turned out, remarkably enough, that Szilard had discussed this with Khrushchev, who was the premier of Russia at the time. And so we went down the list, and he said, well, Fermi is gone, but Wigner will choose. Oppenheimer, we wrote down Oppenheimer. Feynman, wrote down Feynman. These are all people who were active in one part or another of the Manhattan Project. And then he said, and Szilard. And so he wrote down Szilard. And then he said, and you should be there too. And I said to him, but Leo, that was his first name, I'm not smart the way these guys are. And so Szilard beamed at me and he says, well, I know that, but we're lovable and we need somebody who's lovable. That was a typical Szilard remark. Well, Szilard was sort of behind the famous letter which Einstein signed which was sent to Roosevelt, and which was really the first contact between scientists and the U.S. government in connection with the possibility of making an atomic bomb. The letter was actually drafted by a combination of Einstein, Szilard, and Wigner. Wigner translated it into English. They used German as their language. And the result of the letter, well, historians have different views of how important that attempt to get America interested really was as things happened. There's people like George Bundy, who wrote a wonderful book about the atomic project from the point of view of an historian. And in that book, he insists that the Szilard, Wigner, Einstein, and Teller was involved also, letter really didn't bear as much fruit as some of us think it did. What actually happened was that Roosevelt said, well, we have to look into this, and he assigned it to the Bureau of Standards, a fellow by the name of Lyman Briggs, who was the head of the Bureau of Standards at the time. He was an elderly guy, and he certainly didn't catch the spirit that infused Szilard, Wigner, and Teller. And although the U.S. government came up with $6,000, which was assigned to Enrico Fermi at Columbia University, that was not, I suppose it's fair to say, was not the way the Manhattan Project really got started. But it helped. Well, I have here some of the other people. This one is Wigner. And, you know, Wigner is the patron saint of Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And the big auditorium at the laboratory is called the Wigner Auditorium. And although Wigner died several years ago at the age of 92, he is still beloved and respected as, in a way, the founding father of the modern Oak Ridge National Laboratory. I first met Eugene Wigner in his office on the University of Chicago campus in 1942. I had been helping a theoretical physicist by the name of Carl Eckert in making some diffusion calculations in beryllium. Eckert at that time was a prominent and highly respected theoretical physicist who was a member of the Uranium Committee, which was set up as a result of the Einstein letter to President Roosevelt. And the University of Chicago was a place where the possibility of using beryllium as a moderator in a chain reaction was looked at. And you remember that Szilard had mistakenly thought that beryllium, because of the N2N reaction, could sustain a chain reaction. He was wrong, because that's an endothermic reaction rather than exothermic reaction. Well, so I was an assistant to Carl Eckert for several months, trying to work out the dimensions of block of beryllium and so on that would be necessary in order to get a a real measurement of the absorption in beryllium and what the end-to-end reaction amounted to. One day, late in 1941, I guess it was, Eckert said to me, well, I'm going to the West Coast to work on undersea warfare. And then I said, well, who's going to take your place? And he said, don't worry, Eugene Wigner will be in charge. And I have been transfixed by Eugene Wigner ever since, even though he's been dead for 3 or 4 years. He is, I suppose I have to say, the most remarkable theoretical physicist that I had ever met. And he was a strange combination in that although he was a self-taught theoretical physicist, he never used to say, well, he never had a course in physics. He nevertheless became one of the foremost theoreticians of his age. But he also, in addition to having this tremendous aptitude for physics, you got a problem? He also had a wonderful instinct for engineering, because the only education he had was in engineering. He got a PhD, actually, in chemical engineering. Well, it was a sort of fancy kind of chemical engineering. It was where he and Polanyi developed the absolute reaction rate theory, which depended upon applications of the then new quantum mechanics. So Wigner arrived at Chicago, and I became a kind of assistant of his. And the reason I suppose I'm here in Oak Ridge now is because Wigner, at the end of the war, said, well, Oak Ridge is a very nice place. There are good people there. It ought to be made into a permanent establishment. And how about you going down there, and I will come a little later. And that's actually what happened. Wigner was very much of the old European school, and he was, above all, marvelously polite. His politeness was proverbial, and the saying was that it was impossible to go through a door after Wigner. He always insisted that you go before him. At that time, in late 1941, what became the Manhattan Project was divided into several branches that were working more or less independently. There was the Chicago branch, there was the Columbia branch, there was the Princeton branch, there was the University of California branch. The big boss was Arthur Compton, who, as many of you know, received the Nobel Prize for his observation of the Compton effect. And he decided that to really make progress, everything had to be put together. And the question is, where would it all be gathered together? And Compton, being a professor at the University of Chicago, said it shall be at Chicago. And that's how it happens that Chicago is where the first chain reaction was established. I'd like to remark that in this respect, Compton's decision to centralize everything meant the difference perhaps between failure and success, because the German project, which got started about the same time, was never centralized. There were always separate professors who squabbled a bit about who would get this amount of uranium or that amount of heavy water. Now, the scientific leader of the Chicago project was this person here. That's my wife. This is Enrico Fermi, and you'll notice that he has the fine structure constant alpha, but it's amusing because the formula is wrong. It took some people to realize that the square should be downstairs, not upstairs. How would I characterize Enrico Fermi? Well, he was a guy who said that he liked to do experiments for 5 years, and then he would do theory for 1 year. And in this way, he would keep his hand both in experiments and in theory. And I guess you would just describe him as being the coolest cucumber you ever could imagine. He would never get frustrated or flustered. He would always know exactly what was going on. How did he know it? Well, he worked harder than anybody else. He would get up early in the morning and start his calculations on what had to be done the next day. And it was he who invented the exponential experiment, which was a subcritical reactor in which one put a source of radium, beryllium neutrons at the top, and then one measured the distribution, and the neutron distribution fell exponentially, and the closer you were to critical, the longer would be the wavelength of the exponential, and you could determine what the K infinity for that lattice was by measuring what the decay of the neutrons was. About 20 such exponential experiments were performed at Chicago, all under the direction of Enrico Fermi. And the final exponential experiment was an experiment in which the lattice for the Hanford reactors was tested, and that's how we were able to estimate how much uranium would be required for the Hanford production reactors. Let's see, how long?
You have 1 hour total. You have 30 more minutes.
30 more minutes, yeah, good. Who was more important in the project, Fermi or Wigner? Well, I would say it was a toss-up. Either one of them could have been by himself the whole show. Fermi, of course, did experiments as well as doing theory. Wigner did engineering as well as theoretical physics, and he was very good at the engineering. Let me tell you a little bit about the atmosphere at the metallurgical project, as it was called. At the very beginning, it was necessary to decide on how seriously to take this cuckoo idea of making a new element and then extracting it and then making a bomb out of it, which owes a great deal to a fellow by the name of Lou Turner at Princeton, who noticed that the transuranic elements that had an even atomic weight and atomic number were likely to be fissile, and plutonium number 94 and an even odd, and 239 was predicted to be fissile, and in fact it turned out that plutonium was fissile. But at the very beginning of the project, there was big argument about how should we cool what became the Hanford reactors. And the main line at the very beginning, that's in early 1942, was helium cooling. That you would just have the lattice and then you'd have hot helium go over slugs to remove the heat. Szilard proposed using lead bismuth as the coolant, and the reason he chose lead bismuth was it was a way of getting high temperature at low pressure, but also bismuth and lead had rather low capture cross sections. And you must realize that in the very earliest days, especially to a young guy like me who didn't know anything about nuclear physics at the time, the whole idea of a chain reaction just seemed out of this world. In fact, I always, at the beginning, took the attitude, well, I'd spend 6 months doing this, and then I'd either join the Army or do something that is more relevant. Wigner, with that instinct for engineering, insisted that the lead bismuth cooling was too far beyond what general practice was. And in this he was correct, because it turned out when they started circulating lead bismuth in loops, mass transfer was very large. And so you could never have built it without lots of research. And with respect to helium, he said, you have a terrible fuel element problem, because the fuel, which would be oxide, would have to be very hot, and therefore again you would have a materials problem that you'd have to contend with. And so he said, we've been boiling water in aluminum cans or aluminum pots for many years. Water is what we should use. And he had the advantage of being the only person, aside from Fermi, at the laboratory, who both understood the physics of the chain reaction sufficiently so that he could compute what the K-infinity was and what the K-infinity with water and without water was, and had confidence in his engineering judgment to realize that if you went down the helium road or went down the lead bismuth road, you would never be able to get anything and make a difference in the war. Let me divert the subject for a moment and say something about making a difference in the war. In addition to the plutonium project, which was centered both the bomb and the reactor at Chicago, and then the bomb part was sent to Los Alamos, and Oppenheimer would show up at Los Alamos, not at Chicago. The work on the I lost my train of thought, but you just have to bear with me for 1 second.
It happens to people like others.
Yeah. Well, let me just say that, yes, now I remember where I was. In addition to the plutonium project, there was the isotope separation project, which was centered at Columbia University. And the people involved in the Columbia project were Walter Zinn, who then became Fermi's assistant, and I don't have a picture of another fellow whom some of you may know, some may not, Carl Cohen. Any of you ever hear of Carl Cohen? Yeah, well, a couple of you have. And I've been in correspondence with Carl in preparation for this talk. And he told me the following, which was quite remarkable. He said that there are various ways of separating the isotopes. One was gaseous diffusion, one was centrifuge, one was liquid thermal diffusion. And Carl, who was really the first one to work out the theory of the large cascade, and then later Manson Benedict got into that business. But Carl insisted that the gaseous diffusion method was the wrong way to go. That a more correct way would have been centrifuges. But the effort on centrifuge in America was a failure. The bearings that a guy by the name of Zippy invented while he was a prisoner of war in Russia did not come until about 1947 or thereabouts. So the centrifuge method was aborted. Well, Carl at that time, and this is what he wrote me, realized that the only reason he had decided to work on the U-235 bomb was because he felt that you could do it sufficiently quickly to avoid the Normandy beaches and the Holocaust. It's the only reason that he was interested. And then when he saw that the project was taking a wrong turn in his view, in the sense that it would take a much longer time to work out the diffusion plant, he quit the project. He quit the project in 1944, late in 1944. And I must say that I find that very admirable, that he had enough self-confidence to do what he felt was right, that he was not interested in the bomb against Japan. He was interested in the bomb against Germany, and he quit the project. Well, I have some other personalities that I brought along here. I'll just indicate them to you. See, how much time do I have? 20 minutes. Yeah. Here is a gathering of old-timers, which was sponsored by this little Institute for Energy Analysis, and the meeting was a workshop on an acceptable nuclear future. And one of the things we discussed was, would it be possible to have inherently safe reactors? And were there things that ought to be done to improve the outlook for nuclear energy? And this took place in about 1976. And here are a number of important people in the business. There's Manson Benedict. There's Peter Fortescue, who was the brains of the British gas cooling. Here's Carl Cohn, whom I've spoken to you about, who became the chief nuclear guy at General Electric. Here's Joe Dietrich, who was at Combustion, and there's Dr. Cohn from Westinghouse. Here's Alvin Weinberg. There's Jimmy Lane. And these were all people who were interested in seeing what can be done to rev up nuclear. Because by that time, this guy, Ed Schmidt, how many of you knew Ed Schmidt? Well, all these people are dead and gone. But Ed Schmidt was the gray eminence of the General Electric Company. He was the guy that was the advisor to the president of GE. And when I was the director of the Office of Energy Research and Development in Washington and occupied a beautiful set of offices in the White House, he was a consultant on our staff, and the message that he brought, and this was in the year 1974, he would intone, "The first nuclear era is over, let us prepare for the second nuclear era." And this was 26 years ago. And the reason he made pronouncements like this was because being at the top of the General Electric Company, he could look at the balance sheet of the General Electric Company, and it wasn't a profit-making organization as far as nuclear was concerned. And so he would always tell us, you got to prepare for the next nuclear era. Well, what you have here is a group picture. Oh, yeah. A group picture taken when I was a liaison officer, as they called it, between Chicago and the English, Canadian, and French project, which for a while was in Montreal. This is a project that eventually led to the Chalk River reactors, and in a way, I suppose, it led to Harwell. Well, there are people here that I'd like to point out. There I am, a much younger person than this. This is George Volkoff. This was George Plotchik, who was the theorist. This was Cockcroft, who became the head of the British project. And this was Pierre Auger, who for a while was in charge of the project at Montreal. Now, it's interesting that in this picture are the two atomic spies who were at Chalk River. One of them was Alan Nunn May, and the other was Punta Corvo. I think this is Punta Corvo, and I think this is Alan Nunn May. And Alan Nunn May spent about 12 years in prison when he was finally caught. I could comment on the distinction between what these guys did when the West had a monopoly and Wen Ho Lee, but I will leave that for questions afterwards. Well, let me turn to another aspect of the matter, and this is the what has to be done now to ensure the survival of nuclear energy. I know this is a hard way to put it, that what's at issue is the survival of nuclear energy, and yet if you look at what's happening in Europe, even in Russia, in the United States, where we haven't built or ordered a new reactor in 22 years, the issue is an important one. And what I would like to do in the remainder of my time is to point out what I call necessary conditions for the survival of nuclear energy. But in identifying necessary conditions, I am not saying that if you do these things, then nuclear energy will survive. There's a difference between necessary and sufficient conditions. Well, where shall I start? The first, if not necessary condition, but at least a desirable situation, would be that carbon dioxide gets taken very, very seriously. If you look at the literature that is now put out by pro-nuclear groups such as the Nuclear Energy Institute, NEI, then more and more you find that the justification for nuclear energy is given in terms of the amount of carbon that will be avoided if you go to nuclear energy. Well, I asked Bud Perry, who many of you know, to look into this matter, and he came up with this table in which he calculates the amount of carbon that would be avoided if you burn 1 million tons of uranium. By burning 1 million tons of uranium, I mean you dig out 1 million tons and then you extract from it the part that can be used in reactors, and some reactors use more than 0.1%, some use less than a few percent. And the surprising thing that we found was that even if you burned 1 million tons of uranium, and if you look at the amount of uranium that's been burned altogether by nuclear energy, it's just about 1 million tons as of now. The amount of carbon that would be avoided per million tons of uranium is about 5.5 gigatons, which isn't all that much because man is putting into the atmosphere about 6 gigatons of carbon every year. Well, if you then say, well, that's if you burn 0.5%, but suppose you had a breeder, then it looks very much better, even at 1 million tons. And if you have 30 million tons, then you do in fact have an answer to the man's emission of carbon, at least in principle, by moving to the breeder. Well, this came as a bit of a shock to me when I first noticed this, because it means that the breeder is necessary if nuclear energy is going to play a really important role in cutting back on carbon. Well, is there reason to believe that we will come to that state of affairs? Some of you may have noticed in several issues of the magazine Nature in the past few months that there's strong evidence, although I guess there are those who would dispute this, there's strong evidence that 55 million years ago, the experiment, what happens when you put large amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, what happens to the fauna, to the atmosphere, to the ice and so on. That experiment was carried out because it seems that at that time, for reasons that I won't go into, the seas became warmer. The seas became so warm that the methane hydrates, of which there are maybe 20,000 gigatons, become unstable. And so there is apparently strong evidence that if you throw enough carbon into the atmosphere, then really bad things happen. Oh.
The red light comes on
Yeah.
that bad.
And so my guess is that if this methane hydrate story is sustained, that this will be a reason why people will begin taking the carbon issue very seriously, and this cannot help but be further justification for nuclear energy. As I say, at present, nuclear people tend to use carbon as their justification without realizing that if it's to really be a long-term solution, then you have to go to the breeder. And this means that if I were Mr. Richardson and had got over the Wen-Ho Lee thing, I would strongly support the development of the breeder. And finally, I will say another thing, if I can find. I had it out here just a few minutes ago, and I was showing it to Fred Minot. It's the fact that the one sure way to make nuclear energy economical is to make sure that the nuclear reactors last a very long time. And here, this is a curve of what the total cost of a kilowatt of electricity from nuclear plants, what the cost is as a function of how long the plant lasts. And you see that when you get out here at 50 or 60 years, when you've already paid for the capital cost, or somebody has lost money on the capital cost, then you have a free ride. And this is becoming evident to people nowadays, and that's why you see people gobbling up these nuclear reactors and saying we expect to run them for another 20, another 30, another 50 years. And we do have precedent for that. I mentioned to Fred that there is a James Watt steam engine that lasted until 1918. And although it was terribly inefficient, it was still okay to run it because you had already paid for the thing. Well, I hope that this talk, which is a hybrid between anecdotes about great men and peering into a very uncertain future, is of some use to you. I hope that I have given you an idea of how the old days were and what the new days might possibly become. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for a question or two. And before I ask if there are questions from the local audience here, since we have this new medium with colleagues at Georgia Tech, is there anybody at Georgia Tech that has a question for Dr. Weinberg? If you do, you should come to the microphone and let him see you. Is anybody there, Dwayne, has a question? Anybody have any questions? I've got a question. General Leslie Grove, how much interaction did you have with him? In case you don't know who he was the guy that was really the boss of everybody, including Fermi.
Right.
And so if you had some interaction with him.
Well, I was pretty low in the totem pole at the metallurgical project, so I didn't really interact directly with him. But many years later, Clark Center, who was the boss of Union Carbide Nuclear at the time, this must have been about 1965 or 63. He and I were in New York, and we were staying at the Waldorf, and we went down to the men's bar, the Waldorf, and who was there but General Groves. He had been retired by that time. And so we sat with him for about 45 minutes, and he regaled us over these shot glasses. You know, in the men's bar, the way they work it is like it used to be in Western saloons, where they take one of these large bottles of whiskey and put it down and give you a couple of shot glasses, and then they measure how much of the whiskey is gone, and then that's how they figure what your bill is. And General Groves was in a talkative mood. And he told me something that I don't think is fully recognized. He said that before, this point I'm now going to make, he mentioned in his book, Now It Can Be Told. He said that he and I guess it was Captain and then Admiral Purnell of the Navy talked quite often about how the bomb would be used. And they seem both to have agreed that there would have to be two bombs. The first bomb to tell them what it's like to be bombed, and the second bomb to tell the Japanese that, well, we had more bombs. Well, what actually happened was that President Truman himself was the one who finally made the decision to use the Hiroshima bomb. But as far as the Nagasaki bomb is concerned, that decision devolved to General Groves. At least that's what he said. And it was he himself who made the decision to drop the Nagasaki bomb. He did not check it with Truman. And as I say in his book, he says that that was the plan that he and Purnell had arrived at.
Okay. One more question.
Since we're talking about personalities, did you have personal interaction with Feynman? What was he like?
Well, Feynman was Feynman. I guess you read his book, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. And in that book, he says that when he transferred from Princeton to Los Alamos, he stopped in at Chicago for 3 days and to find out what was going on in Chicago. And he says that he was presented with an integral that the Stoops at Chicago couldn't evaluate. And he showed them how to evaluate the integral. And he didn't quite use the word Stoops, but that's what he implied. Well, the Stoops that he referred to was Alvin Weinberg. So I did not know Feynman well at all, but there is a person in Oak Ridge who is his best friend at Los Alamos and at MIT, and that's Ted Welton. So if you really want to get the lowdown on Feynman, it's seen by a colleague of his, ask Ted Welton.
Okay. With that, let's express our appreciation to Dr. Weinberg. And we also bid farewell well to our Georgia Tech colleagues, and we hope to do this again in the near future. Thank you for joining us.